Hello everybody, I'm Emma Richmond from the Faculty of Humanities at the University of Manchester. This seminar is part of an occasional series about doing things differently, looking at society, politics and economics during and after the COVID-19 crisis. Pandemics exacerbate existing inequalities in society. We're seeing this in numerous ways during the coronavirus crisis, and in a previous seminar, we've discussed the ways that Black and minority ethnic communities have been particularly affected by the virus. Today, we've brought together a fantastic panel of speakers to talk about the impact of the pandemic on women and the world of work. So if we can introduce ourselves, please, starting with you, Francesca.
Hi, I'm Francesca Gains. I'm a professor of public policy and I'm interested, therefore, in how policy-making processes work, especially around gender and devolution.
Thank you very much. And Deborah, could you introduce yourself, please?
Hi, I'm Debbie Price. I'm a professor of social gerontology here at the University of Manchester, and my main interest is in how women's lives across the life course lead to where they end up in later life. I'm especially interested in pensions and poverty in later life.
Thank you very much. And Jill, if I can hand to you.
Hello, I'm Jill Rubery. I'm a professor of comparative employment systems in the University of Manchester and the director of the Work and Equalities Institute. My main interest is in employment and social policies, and I have particular interest in comparative employment research in Europe and on gender issues in Europe.
Thank you very much. And finally, Bina.
Hi, I'm a professor of development economics and environment at the Global Development Institute at the University of Manchester, and I particularly work on the rural economy, on agriculture, on women's rights in property and land, and on environmental governance.
Thank you very much. So across the world, women are facing huge challenges as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. Roles within the paid workforce are under threat. Women are taking on a disproportionate burden of care in both paid and unpaid contexts, and existing social inequalities are being exacerbated by the crisis. Today, we're going to discuss the effect of the pandemic on women and how we can build back differently to create a fairer world. So to begin with, perhaps Jill, could you outline for us some of the key issues that women are facing during this pandemic?
Yes. I think there are three main issues. First of all is the impact on paid work. Secondly, the impact on income protection. And thirdly, this experiment in the integration of work and care that's come with this massive expansion of telework. So if I look at the impact on paid work, it's a very polarized situation because on the one hand, many women are in the front line having to work more and under great stressful situations. On the other hand, more women are likely to be furloughed in the UK and to have lost their jobs or to have felt they had to quit because of the problem of combining work and care. And there's a very high risk that women will be losing employment once job retention schemes and furloughs come to an end, partly because the growth of women's employment over recent decades has been in a way based on the notion of women being really good at social relations and face-to-face contact. And of course, that's where the problems still remain with the virus still being present. And there's also the issue of care, that with the continuing uncertainties about care and schooling, and in the UK, the likely collapse of the nursery system, because it's private and it hasn't been properly supported, then we don't know whether women are going to be able to get back to work. So that's the first thing. A second issue is income protection, and most countries across Europe have been really done a pretty good job in introducing job retention schemes and support for people's wages. And it's interesting that they've done a lot more to include more of the sectors and types of employment in which women are employed than was true in the last financial crisis. For example, in Germany, which was praised for its short-term work system that reduced unemployment, actually only 1 in 4 of the beneficiaries of that scheme at that time were women. I think that has changed, but there are still major gaps. Domestic workers are often excluded, for example. France has done a good job in including them on the same terms. Italy initially excluded them, but now has come back in with a scheme under public pressure, but it's paying them less than other workers. So there's still major problems for women that they are not falling through this social protection net. And then finally, the third main issue is this work and care integration through telework. Most of the research in the UK is suggesting that women are picking up the bulk of the care work, but it's interesting that men are also doing more, which may have hopeful long-term consequences that maybe could bring about some kind of change. But nevertheless, in the UK, there's been no specific parental leave arrangements, unlike in most of Europe. And women are often expected to do the double shift, to do a full telework shift and cope with their care responsibilities. And research evidence is showing that women are less able to work from home in that context because they're more likely to be interrupted. And I think I'll come back to this later, but I think there are major dangers about this teleworking for women as well.
Thank you, Jill. Bina, if I can hand over to you, please.
Thank you. So I'll paint a very different scenario because unlike the UK, in a developing country like India, almost 90% of the labor force is in the informal sector, and women much more than men are informal workers. Most are in fact in agriculture and the rural economy, since men tend to migrate more for jobs. So today, 71% of rural women workers compared to 53% of rural male workers are in agriculture. In urban areas, it's the reverse. Only 20% of something like 60 million internal migrant workers are women, and they work as construction labor, domestic workers, vegetable vendors, and so on. And almost none have social protection. So in the immediate short run, and I distinguish between short and long run, in the immediate short run, COVID-19 has had really dire effects on Indian women, both directly and indirectly. In direct terms, and there have been a number of telephone surveys which report that there have been huge income losses for both women and men, but women are worse affected. And this is especially because they have a much narrower spectrum of jobs. For instance, a survey of urban self-employed women across 20 trades found that all the women had lost incomes due to a lack of demand under lockdown. Also, women are healthcare workers and they are more at risk than men. So consider this, 83% of nurses and midwives are female, while 84% of doctors are male. So due to a medical hierarchy, nurses are found less likely to get scarce protective gear than doctors. But indirectly also women who are poor are the worst affected. So I'll share a few instances. So firstly, with the return of millions of male migrants to villages, women's workloads have increased. And it's not just in cooking, as you would imagine, but also in fetching water, in fetching firewood, which is still a major source of cooking fuel in rural India. Secondly, many of the returned migrants are now seeking local jobs, and they can overcrowd rural jobs and displace women in some of these jobs. So for instance, India has the Mahatma Gandhi Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, and this guarantees 100 days of manual work per household per year. But already thousands of new men have registered. So we need to expect that women could be crowded out. Thirdly, in past decades, poverty has been declining hugely in India, as we know. But now we are seeing reversals because millions of new people are being added to extreme poverty and they're facing hunger. And more women than men are in poor households are likely to go hungry due to the intra-household unequal sharing of food. Also, to cope with poverty, we don't normally think about this, but if you're very poor, households often sell their assets. And since women own more immovable assets, like jewelry, they tend to be sold first, and this will disempower women. Fourthly, and linked to this, domestic violence we know has already been rising under lockdowns, but this could worsen because my own research shows that male unemployment is linked to higher domestic violence, as is the weakening of women's fallback position if they lose jobs and they lose assets. And fifthly, and again, there's something we think less about, with higher male mortality under COVID, large numbers of women are facing widowhood and destitution. But our widows' pensions are totally inadequate. So basically, with poor social protection in informal jobs, vast numbers of women are being left poorer, jobless, and hungry. In other words, what we are seeing is what I call developmental reversals, at least in the short term. But in the long term, in my view, it is precisely the rural economy which has the most potential for transformation. But that is if we focus on cooperation, on equity, and on institutions. But this is a point I will come back to later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bina. And Debbie, if I can move to you now and kind of think about a little bit about older women and how they've been affected.
One of the things that I wanted to talk about, Emma, was the impact of the things that Jill and Bina have been speaking about on what will happen to these women when they are older. So thinking about the life course, and if we think about the next 20 years or 20 or 30 years, women who are in their 20s and 30s now, what is their pathway to later life going to be? Because all of the things that we're talking about women's tendency to informal work, tendency to insecure work. In the UK, that's as true as anywhere else, where 70% of low earners are women, the majority of 0 hours contract workers are women, and 74% of part-time workers are women. We know women's jobs are going to be at much higher risk of redundancy. That's already happened after the furlough period is over, and the collapse of the childcare system. All of these things will have long-term implications for how many resources and how much pension these women can accumulate across their life course. We also have something very concerning happening in what we in the gerontology world call the extended working life agenda. So this is a global agenda in the face of aging populations to encourage both men and women to work for longer and longer and longer. And of course, this depends on all sorts of things like health and so on. But what we do know about this period is that women who are in work in the 10 years around state pension age here, for example, the 5 years before, the 5 years after, they are much more likely to be in work in that period of their lives if they have long-term histories of paid work in their lives. If they have large gaps in paid work in their lives because of childcare, caring responsibilities, and the way society is structured, they're actually less likely to be able to extend their working life. All of these things are adding up to women's much poorer accumulation of long-term provision, particularly in terms of savings, pensions, housing, and so on. And I think we really need to think very hard about this. The other two things that are happening that will affect long-term outcomes for women is we are anticipating an increase in separation and divorce for couples, not only as a result of the lockdown itself, which has caused great strain for many families, but also because if there's mass unemployment among men and so on, these things tend to play out in the way families form and separate. When women separate, they tend to become lone mothers. And with the collapse of the childcare sector that Jill was talking about, we also have very serious problems in a major form of childcare, which is grandparent care, which keeps economies across the world going and is proving very problematic. Lone mothers have very few options. So if we don't provide the right infrastructure for what is going to happen for them, we're going to see huge reverses in the gains that have been made in the last 30 years. The final thing I want to talk about is old age care, because we have tended in sociology to focus very much on childcare. But the extended working life agenda, which is trying to encourage people to work, say, up to 70, means that the cohorts that are helping to support sometimes very unwell older parents in their 50s and 60s are now also expected to be at work, but also will be increasingly affected by care needs. And one of the things that COVID is proving is that it affects men in these age groups, 60s and 70s and 80s. And if they survive, they are likely to have a higher propensity to have long-lasting health conditions. We're seeing rises in all sorts of morbidities. So the care implications for people from their 50s onwards, both for partners and parents, will interfere with their ability to work. All of that, to do paid work, they will be working very hard. All of that under our particular social protection system, which says that you have to accumulate resources through paid work for your later life. This becomes incredibly problematic for women.
Thank you, Debbie. Francesca, I'm going to move to you now and perhaps talk a little bit about policy making and what needs to be done in those areas.
Yeah. Obviously, the contributions so far have set out the real problems of dealing with the pandemic and thinking about the aftermath. And so my perspective is looking a little bit at the politics and policy making processes around that. And I had two key concerns, really. One was about voice in making decisions, and the other was about data in making decisions. So my first concern was the lack of women in decision-making roles as the crisis unfolded. Now, my expertise is in UK politics, but this isn't a UK-only problem. The UN reports that 70% of health and social care sector workers are women, only 25% of national legislators are women, and only 7% of heads of government or state are women. So that, the voice there is very unsupported. And certainly in the UK, which is where I understand the institutions better, I was very concerned to see that it was the Prime Minister and a quad of 4 male ministers that were taking the initial decisions. That I had a concern that wouldn't allow the kind of diversity of experience to be brought to bear in making these decisions. And I do wonder that had there been a better gender balance during the crisis, whether things like the vulnerability of women to domestic abuse, the lack of PPE for care workers, the vulnerability of elderly care, home residents, mainly female, and the loss of childcare, whether these issues would have come to the top of the political agenda sooner than they did. So I think it's absolutely essential to counter that lack of voice in thinking about recovery. And then the second issue is in the data, the evidence that's there for policymakers to use. And, during the last global economic crisis after 2008, certainly again in the UK, it was very clear that women bore the brunt of the tax and benefit changes that were taken during austerity to rebalance, pay back government debt. And I think that the impact on the economy of the global financial crisis may not be as serious as the crisis that we've got coming due to COVID-19. And I think it's absolutely essential that policymakers here and elsewhere take account of the gendered effect of the changes to work and in how to manage government finances. Otherwise, we do risk this huge loss of productivity, talent from the world of work, and retrenchment into for women into the work of unpaid caring work. So those are my two key concerns about the processes around the pandemic: voice and data.
Thank you, Francesca. Francesca, kind of looking in a more towards the longer term, the panel has outlined numerous challenges and issues that women are facing, and a rare few kind of positives within the situation. Are there any positives that we can take from the coronavirus response, and what should we be doing to build a brighter, better future for women in the aftermath of all this?
Well, I've got 3 brief points to make, and then I think my colleagues have got the knowledge of what can be done better. But the point I want to make is, firstly, research shows, and this is in the UK and in Europe, that it's very difficult to get measures to support gender equality onto political agendas when GDP is falling. So ordinarily, one would expect that this period of global recession is going to be hugely detrimental to the cause of gender equality. However, I am hopeful in 3 respects, and I'll just say these briefly before handing back to my colleagues for their more nuanced and detailed policy advice. But first of all, I think the awareness of equality matters is much higher and more positive than it's ever been before. You know, the awareness of the differential impact of the disease on B and E communities, the role played by mainly female key workers in low-paid, risky jobs, the strength of feeling about Black Lives Matter in communities and institutions. So I think there is this awareness of equalities and the importance of understanding equalities in a way I've not seen before. Secondly, I think that the kind of community responses to lockdown has brought forward new political actors and new women into political activity that could be incredibly positive from the ground up. And the third thing, and this is a UK specific point, is that the government does seem still to be committed, very committed to a levelling up agenda and working through devolved government to try and target policy. And I think that offers great opportunities for policy, for academics and universities to work with local policymakers to try and identify the data that's needed in order to target policy activity. Okay.
Fantastic, thank you. Debbie, if I can come back to you now, what do you see as the things that need to happen now to protect women in the future?
I think 2 of the things that need to happen have been really exemplified by what Jill and Francesca and Bina all said. One is, what do we do about protecting women's and mothers' jobs? So, you know, Bina talked about how the agricultural worker scheme is a per household and those jobs may be going to men. There's widespread concern about women being chosen for redundancy because of less productivity, because of the issues that Jill spoke about. You know, data and tracking of what's happening and how we redress that. How do we guarantee mothers' employment? How do we protect people from unfair selection for redundancy because of issues caused by COVID and so on? But I think the much deeper point here is one of social protection. It goes against what Francesca was saying in one sense, because it's about national policies for pensions. So Francesca was talking a lot about localism and ground up and community, but that can't help with national social protection. And the only, if we analyze pension systems all over the world, the only system that works for women is a universal pension. That's non-means tested and that's not linked to paid work. And we can see that because of the informal sector, especially, but also because of the way care plays out over people's lifetimes. So maybe this is a moment in time when particularly countries with nascent pension systems that are not very well developed are choosing what to do to from that sort of World Bank model of link pension accrual to work, paid work, and come back to a social protection model of shared risk, shared responsibility, and providing incomes in later life on a universal basis. I very much hope so, and that women can get their voices across in that sense. But otherwise, I really do fear for the long-term consequences of what's happening.
Thank you. Bina, can I come back to you now?
Yeah. You know, it's very interesting because what I'm going to talk about, I feel in the developing country and India context actually links very well with what Francesca has said and also what Deborah has said. So there are two elements. Firstly, I agree with Deborah that, we absolutely need universal social protection, and also in the Indian context, universal healthcare, because we don't have anything like the NHS, for instance. And here it's really governments who have to come in. They are the ones who will provide it, and we must push governments and hold them accountable for this. The second point of positives that I can see is with communities. I think we must work to transform our food systems and our natural ecosystems by building what I call cooperative rather than competitive economic models of development. So let me elaborate a little bit. It's very interesting that during the lockdown, while many farmers, of course, it's not just interesting, but very, very tragic, that many farmers had huge losses since they couldn't harvest their crops on time. They couldn't sell them, especially perishables like fruits and vegetables. But thousands of women farmers in the state of Kerala actually survived. How? And they were doing group farming. They were pooling their land, labor, and capital in groups of 5 or 6 women for joint cultivation. And they had enough group labor to harvest in time, and they could sell their crops locally or via state support. So the vegetable growers sold their produce to the thousands of women-run community kitchens, which Kerala had set up. So there was a great synergy here. And 87% of over 30,000 groups survived. Also, my own research earlier shows that group farms in Kerala had 1.8 times the annual value of output per hectare and 5 times the net returns per farm relative to individual family farms, 95% of which are male managed. So under COVID-19, actually, Kerala was able to contain both the virus mortality, hunger, as well as much of the negative economic fallout. And I think central to this was its long-term investment in healthcare, decentralized institutions, which Francesca also mentioned, and especially their investment in women. So Kerala has 96% female literacy, and to deal with COVID, some 2.2 million women were connected with WhatsApp groups. And this helped contact tracing. They also were able to use them for reporting domestic violence. And so this is one whole area. But community cooperation has also been very key in conserving India's forests. And, people draw upon forests for their life. At least 1 to 6% globally draw upon forests for food, for firewood, for fodder, for other needs. Now, in the early 2000s, there was something like 100,000 community forestry groups in India. And I'd written a book called Gender and Green Governance, where I'd examined this, and I found that including women significantly increased conservation outcomes. We also find this in water conservation. So in fact, if we move towards agroecological farming and conserving our natural ecosystems with community cooperation, and particularly including women, we'll create millions of jobs. And in my view, these are the kinds of new pathways to economic recovery. But I want to add one element here, and I think for this, we also will need new economic thinking. Because if you take conventional economics, it's deeply pessimistic about cooperative solutions because it overemphasizes self-interest as the guiding force of human behavior. We see this in prisoner dilemma games and models. We see it also in theory of collective action. But we've also had new developments within economics. And I think we need to draw on those branches of economics and the social sciences which have challenged these conservative ideas. And these challenges have come from ecological, institutional, and feminist perspectives. So I think as within the academe also, we can provide a supportive base with data, but also in the kinds of models that we want to emphasize.
Thank you, Bina. And finally, Jill, I'm going to turn to you for some solutions.
Some of my concerns also match with everybody else's. I'm particularly concerned or hopeful, if you like, that this greater awareness of the need for social protection for everybody, not just those in regular work, might lead to the development of more universal social protection systems. I think the self-employed in the UK have been growing partly because they pay low social insurance contributions, and that's encouraged employers to make use of labour that they're not actually providing any security for. And so I think it's really important that we actually have a new conversation about social protection. So that's one thing, and that's been stressed already. I'd also want to bring in, come back to what Francesca was stressing about the greater awareness of the importance of some women's jobs in care. And I think people have been shocked to find out how low paid and 0 hours contracts these women are working. And I think that this is an opportunity to actually change the conversation, particularly about social care. I've worked a lot on social care and found that women are often paid below the minimum wage and really treated abominably. And really we need to push on this in the UK as a first priority. I also think that there's the opportunity for teleworking to become more the norm, but I see that as both an opportunity for greater integration of work and care for both women and men, but also a risk for women. I think the risk is that women might be seen as only working on telework and excluded from the workplace. If you like, it might be a sort of retrograde step pushing women back into the home and reducing their opportunities to integrate into more public life. Employers will see opportunities to cut costs by getting rid of offices and workplaces. So I think we need to push for teleworking for all, but teleworking as a mixed way of working with other kinds of working. Otherwise, I think it will be an impoverished work environment rather than seeing it as a positive thing that women can work at home and we can solve the care issue like that. And I think it is really important that we rebuild the care infrastructure, both childcare and elder care. I don't have any real solutions on the elder care front, but I do think that care homes are going to be extremely unpopular, shall we say, as options for both the elderly person and for the if you like, the children who would feel responsible for putting them in care homes after this major crisis. So we need to find new community ways of caring, more domiciliary care, more day centres, etc., so that there's still some institutionalised support for elder care and not leaving it all up to families. But I want to come now to my sort of major, more big idea, if you like, and that is that what we really need in emerging from this crisis is to think about work sharing. At the moment, we're in danger in the UK and many other countries of moving into really high rates of unemployment. And we know that unemployment is really bad for people's mental health and well-being. We also know that there's a real danger that women this time are going to be in the front line of those people put into unemployment. What we're not talking about is sharing work across the whole of a workforce in a company, rather than deciding who's going to be unemployed and who's going to remain working full-time as normal. I think we need to move towards a more general approach to work sharing, and that has long-term benefits as the only route to which we can really change the gender division of labour in the home, as well as changing the gender division at work. Deborah was talking about the increase in elder care that's going to come along. Now, actually, I think one thing that may have changed a little bit is that men increasingly do see more responsibility for their own parents than expecting their wives to be the carers of their own parents. So we need the opportunity for men to work shorter hours. We need to move towards a 30-hour week for everybody, so everybody can combine work and care. And this should be a conversation about how we move into this new normal of partial opening up of economies, reductions in probably in the service economy, but we need to manage that through sharing out the work that is still there and sharing out the increasing work of care.
Thank you, Jill. That's fascinating. Just for these final few minutes, we're just going to open up the discussion a little bit so that we can all kind of reflect on on everyone's key points around solutions. So, Bina, I think you had a point to raise.
Yes. Yes, thank you. I had a couple of thoughts. One was on this, the issue of work sharing, and I think a class analysis might be quite helpful and also much more ethnic. So even if you take the UK, I think among academe, among professional couples, and it's the same in India, you find they're more willing to share because ideas of masculinity are less embedded and so on. Whereas if you take poorer families, or even if you take certain communities within the UK, you'll find that those ideas people will be less open to that. It's different with elder care, because I've seen lots of men, as you said, actually take care of elderly parents in South Asia, and I'm sure that's true of South Asians in the UK as well, and possibly other communities. The second was, it struck me during this COVID. I live in a colony, and in parts of Delhi, you have resident welfare associations. Now, in smaller colonies, they actually, you elect a president and you elect office bearers, and they've been hugely helpful in giving us information through WhatsApp. They've been available to ensure if there are elderly people and they need delivery of vegetables and other things. And, although these are not everywhere, but I think the notion that communities could actually be built even in urban areas, I don't think it's a far off dream. And I've often wondered that sometimes when we call people elderly, 60 plus, it's elderly, but, many people who are not extremely ill or anything are actually the elders, and the younger people could mutually provide care. If parents are at work, why can't young teenagers sit down with older people in a colony, not necessarily their own grandparents if they're not there. I've seen a bit of that in the United States happening, where young people, contribute, go every Sunday and say, I'm going to help somebody in the neighborhood. So those are the ideas, I think, of other regarding, which we as economists, the economics profession doesn't encourage that, as I had said. But those are the ideas I think we could build on, and I really feel hope on that.
Thanks, Bina. Debbie, what did you want to come in?
I have a question actually for Bina and Francesca, but I just wanted to say a couple of things about how active, productive and economically important older people are around the world. I don't think anybody should get the impression that older people require care. Most of the intergenerational transmission is the other way, of people providing support and care to young financial and material and care to younger generations. So we live in a very mutual society intergenerationally, and we need to just, I think, sometimes step back a little bit. But my question is about how to get more collaborative feminist perspectives into economic and political agendas. Because this issue of collaborative perspectives, it bedevils pensions, the belief that competition is going to deliver better pensions than a collaborative way of doing things. And we're talking here about it bedeviling work, bedeviling care work, bedeviling the way people share at home. So I just, in a sort of echo chamber, a lot of people I know think very passionately that we need more collaborative perspectives, but we actually need national governments to think that. So how do we bridge that gap?
Yes, I think that's a really good question, Debbie. And certainly when I've talked to policymakers in central government about when they've been able to get significant fiscal measures that support gender equality onto agendas, it's usually because you have to make an economic case. So there nearly always has to be a rationale that shows that it's supporting an increase in productivity, for example. But I agree with all of you that it's time to have a new conversation about how to value economic activity and the unpaid activity. So that gets harder. I don't have the answer there, except for I think men have appreciated in some cases the opportunity to be more involved in their family life. They have to speak up too, as well as having women's voices. And I think policymakers need to work with some of the sectors to encourage family-friendly and, as Jill says, reduced hours working that is gender sensitive, rather than assuming women need to do the childcare.
But Francesca, isn't the problem that if the focus is always on making an economic case around economic productivity, actually what Bina was talking about was resilience, which is doesn't make you more productive or more profitable. And I think if we keep getting sucked into this argument about we have to make the economic case, we have to make the economic case for care, we have to make the economic case for this, actually we can't talk on our own terms. Because a lot of us are actually saying we don't have to make so much profit.
I think you can make an economic case as well for valuing care. And what Bina, when you were talking about the agricultural sector in Kerala, made me think about the care work that's done in Greater Manchester, and that supports the foundational economy. And we can find different ways to talk about how to value unpaid work as well as paid work.
I think, no, I agree. I mean, you have to make multiple cases. You're right, there are hard-headed policymakers who will only listen to the economic argument. But I think we've moved beyond that. And what's very interesting about Kerala is actually they built on an institutional a factor which worked. For instance, if you think about the Grameen Bank microcredit experiments, which were launched by Muhammad Yunus, the Nobel laureate in 1972 in Bangladesh, and then that flew, and that became a prototype for the self-help group model in India. There are more than 6 million self-help groups across the country, and these are women doing savings and credit. But that model was the model for group farming and group enterprises in Kerala. So they invested in institutions. And it wasn't just for economic benefit, because I think the language, as you yourself have said, the language of women's empowerment has really permeated policymaking, and that's not fixated solely on economic outcomes. It's looking at the larger picture of what we want for our citizens, and we want them to be much more engaged in politics, in the economy, and in society. So I think we've moved a lot from the early 70s when in the women's movement were raising these questions, to the huge amount of evidence we have today, which people are listening to. So I think I sort of echo both what Deborah is saying and what you are saying, Francesca. I don't know if I've answered Deborah's question, but there's, if I may, one more thing, bringing it back to Manchester. There's in Manchester, there was a post-crash society. The students started after the last economic crisis to say we need a new economics. We need to bring in people to talk about alternative ways of looking at the economy. I've spoken in that, and so have many others. And these are youngsters, undergraduates and graduate students, and it's now spread all over the UK as well in terms of new economic thinking.
Jill, I think you've been waiting to come in for a couple of minutes. Perhaps you have some to say.
Yes, and to some extent I want to respond to what Bina said earlier about the problems on a class basis of what I was suggesting about work sharing, which I fully endorse. There is major problems, but for me the main problem, of course, is first of all income, and what I was suggesting about work sharing does require some redistribution towards those people in low-paid work, raising the minimum wage to a significantly, in order that people across the classes could reduce hours of work. So, and it does require a developed welfare state that can provide that kind of support. And I'm not suggesting that necessarily India is in a situation where work sharing is at this point the key issue. I think I was referring to the UK, where there's a huge problem of some groups in society being work rich and others being work poor, and the work rich groups are also the actual rich groups. But the problem is that people don't have at the moment the option to work in a good job and actually negotiate a shorter working hours package without disadvantaging their future careers even if the employer would accept that. So I do think there is scope for going forward, but it does need more than just work sharing. It needs rethinking our distribution of income, particularly in the UK. But also another comment on the collaboration issue is I do feel that at the moment companies in the UK, and I would include my own university in this, are not engaging its staff in how to get past this crisis. How could we collaborate in finding new solutions? We're talking about, maybe people taking pay cuts or reductions in hours, but it's on an individualized basis rather than a collaborative across the board approach to how can we find an equitable way out of this particular crisis that will preserve the best of the institution in which we're employed, and not damage the institution because of this crisis. And I think that's a model that should be adopted within all organizations rather than this top-down, let's not waste a good crisis and let's displace the women who've got to be at home anyway to look after the kids because the care sector's collapsed. So I think there are opportunities not just in the community, but also within the communities of organizations for a more collaborative approach, which is also something that if more women at the head of organizations, maybe there would be more of a collaborative approach. But I don't want to fall into an essentialist argument that yes, just because it's a woman they're collaborative, because I think that's obviously also a problem of stereotyping. But anyway, okay, thanks.
Fantastic, thank you everybody. Just in our final few minutes, does anyone have any final points they want to raise?
I just wanted to link back to something that Debbie said, which is the fundamental fiscal importance of pensions for women's well-being and income security in later life, and that is a national task, really. That's something that sits with a central exchequer. And so my final thought is that we really do need to get the joining up between the community activism and energy and the institutional action that Jill's talking about, the work of regional policymakers who understand their labour markets locally and where to direct skills funding and business support, and national governments in order to get the right balance of fiscal measures, stimulus and support. And just one final point is that I think that we can learn from each other, and I'm certainly wanting to carry on that conversation with you, Bina, about the work that you've been doing.
Thank you. I just wanted to say one very quickly that I think there is a difference between community in itself and community for itself. And the gap between the two is institutions. So we're all communities in some generalized Benedict Anderson sort of sense, but community for itself requires that we recognize mutual interdependence. And I would go for that. And that's what leads to cooperation.
I think a note of cooperation is a really great place to wrap up our discussion. I'd just like to say a huge thank you to all of our panel today for their incredible insights. If you have any questions, then please do send them to us via social media using #UOMHumanities, and we will do our best to come back to you. Thank you very much, and goodbye.